anymore. The seasons are changing. This weekend was the time for our family to admit that there is not going to be any more any more warmth. There's going to be a lot more weather. To be out there with rakes, moving the leaves that all fell at once after that awful snow on Halloween, and for me to put the garden to bed. I was out there yesterday while everyone else was raking, pulling out dead tomatoes that have been through a freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw cycle, tomatillo, all the things that you want to get every last possible fruit out of, so you don't want to pull them out too early, and then at some point the ship has definitely sailed. So I'm pulling them out so they can throw leaves on. I can get my garlic in the ground tomorrow, or this afternoon rather, and I have a fig tree that I need to sort of put a blanket around. Fig trees do not grow here normally, but I really would like to have one, and so I've spent entirely too long looking at YouTube videos about how exactly you can baby this creature so that it will live and grow in a climate it doesn't belong in. Because it's just that time when we're putting things to bed, when darkness comes earlier and earlier every day, and there's no denying that winter is coming. And that season outside, it makes its way into the church as well. We're looking forward to Advent in December, but even before then, we begin to start hearing these readings that think about last things, that think about ends, right? We began with All Saints Sunday last week as we thought about those who lived in the trust that God's love was beyond what was currently around them and how they showed us how to do that. And from here, our readings are going to lean more and more into the promises of God that this is not all there is, which is good news when this is terrible, and also bad news when we think we're the be-all and end-all. And so this is our season of looking ahead. And we start here with our reading from Luke. And there's a couple of things I hope that we can take away. The first thing is this question from the Sadducees. Why are they asking it? The Sadducees were a group of religious leaders who were doing pretty well. No one likes to be living under Roman occupation, but the Sadducees have kind of negotiated a settlement that keeps them powerful. They're associated with the temple hierarchy. They have sort of a working relationship with the Romans. They're trying to kind of make things work. They tend to be the folks with some resources and some assets, maybe not as much in need of the promise of resurrection as some other folks. They believe only in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and are not as interested in what the prophets have had to say. And for God's people, this idea of the resurrection, that there is life beyond what we can see right now, that God promises even more, comes in the history of God's people as they run into a brick wall and another occupation and another disappointment. The prophets say, look, these promises of God, they're not just limited to flesh and blood here and now. They're bigger and they go beyond. And so many people in Jesus' Jewish community were awaiting the resurrection. That had become a piece of their theology, but not one that the Sadducees were interested in. And so they come to Jesus with this question, and it's a setup. Now, to be fair, Jesus has moved into their territory. We're here actually towards the end of Luke, towards the end of Jesus' story. He has made his way to Jerusalem. The cross is coming soon, and Jesus has set up camp in the temple. This guy, this nobody from nowhere, is sitting in the temple teaching as if he is somebody. And everybody's trying to throw him under the bus at this point. So this question from the Sadducees comes after one from the Pharisees about paying taxes. And do we pay taxes to Caesar, or do we honor God? And Jesus finds a way to answer that question that is not one that will get him killed. But, again, another question, because they're not real pleased with his presence here. Their question isn't really a question. Maybe you've had one of those before, or maybe as you have listened to politicians talk past one another, you know that questions are sometimes really just statements, And they're there to prove a point or to make a lever or a fulcrum in an argument, and not really interested in what the response will be. And so the Sadducees ask this question, and their motivation is simply to prove the ridiculousness of the idea of the resurrection. No question that starts out, there were 7 brothers, ends with anything but a punchline, right? This is supposed to be ridiculous because they want Jesus to look ridiculous. And so I think our first invitation as we sit with this text this morning is to wonder ourselves about the questions that we bring about the resurrection. What's our motivation when we wonder about the resurrection? Sometimes it seems like our conversation about eternity is really there to score a point and prove something. We'd love to read an account of someone who had been there just briefly and come back so that we can say, ha, see, we're right. That's one motivation we might have. Maybe sometimes we have the motivation of wanting to make ourselves secure relative to other folks. It's been a while since those Left Behind books were so popular, but every now and again I still see a bumper sticker that says, in case of rapture, this vehicle will be driverless. And you don't put a sticker like that on the back of your car except to say, ha ha, too bad, to the guy who's left reading it, right? There's this sense that I've got an in. Sorry about you. Or sometimes, and this is probably the truth for a lot of us, we ask our questions in order to sort of micromanage the hereafter, right? We like to be in charge. We are really good at telling God how we'd like things run right here and now, and we're willing to extend that to eternity, right? I would like for there to be fig trees everywhere. The real trap, one of the authors I was reading this week, she said, the real trap with probing matters of the end is the urge to make up scenarios that rhyme with our wishes and our happy experiences, right? God, I would like it to be a certain way, and I'm going to tell you about that so that you can get it all arranged before I get there. But of course, Jesus doesn't send the Sadducees running. He doesn't scold them. He doesn't even try to make them look bad. He meets them where they're at, right? He responds with an answer from the Torah, from the teachings of Moses, from the story of Moses, in a way that they might be able to hear and understand. And if Jesus responds that way to a snarky, hostile question, we can trust that when our questions do come out of our own need, our need for a promise that God's love and justice is bigger than what we see now, that what this world tries to pass off and love and justice is not even a poor imitation. When we come to Jesus because we need good news, we can know Jesus is good news. There is a response for us. When we need good news, Jesus is good news for us. So we can come with our questions. A second piece I hope that we can come and take away from our reading is this. You notice maybe that this setup is a little ridiculous. But even when we're not asking a gotcha question like the Sadducees do, when we ask, so often our imagining is too narrow. Our questions are too small. So the Sadducees want to know, this woman has been passed down from brother number 1 who died with no child, poor brother number 1. Brother number 2 died with no child, poor brother number 2, all the way down the line, those poor brothers died with no child. They're asking a story about these brothers. Who gets the wife in heaven? Whose property will she be? And that's the best case scenario for her, is to be handed down from brother to brother like an object or some property, because her other alternative is to have nobody and nowhere and nothing. So Jesus, who does she belong to? Whose is she? And Jesus' answer is so good because it tells us the story was never about those brothers in the first place. It's about the woman who has been handed down as an object again and again, because those were the only, this is all theoretical, but connected to reality, the only option available to her. And in the resurrection, Jesus says, there is none of this. In the resurrection, she's no longer property. Her primary relationship in the resurrection is not with whichever man is able to provide and define her reality. Her primary relationship in the resurrection is with God, who calls her child, my child. She's not defined by other people. She's not defined by her situation or her heartbreak or her desperate need for someone to provide. She is defined as a child of God standing on her own. In all of its fullness, she gets to be a person when Jesus ends the story. And so it's not necessarily that Jesus is saying we won't get to meet and connect with those that we have loved in the resurrection. We don't necessarily know. But what we do know is that God will be the center. And that all of the things that have defined us in the past, our money, our job, our status, our lack of status, our hunger, our need, none of those have the last word. That God is the center and we will be free as God's children. So the last piece I hope that we can take away is this line that God is the God of the living. That the good news for the end is actually good news for now, too. The resurrection is God's promise that love is stronger than death. The resurrection is God's promise that God's justice is so much bigger than our human time and our institutions. And so we're invited to wonder what it might look like to live now knowing that we're already held in eternity. How would we trust differently? How would we be more free? How would we be more generous? How might we relate differently to those around us? We can spend a lot of time and energy asking or imagining the details of eternal life, and we can channel that energy towards living in the security of that promise. Like Job, in the middle of everything awful that we can imagine and a few things more, Job says, no, I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that this is not all that there is. I know that there is more, regardless of what I see around me. So that's what these coming weeks are going to ask us as we lean into this turn of the season, as the world gets darker and around us we try to fight back with stuff and busyness and lights and bling. The promises of God ask us, well, if we know the end of the story, how do we act in the middle of it, right? If we know that what defines us is temporary, how can we live now as children of God? If Jesus' death and resurrection is God's promise that we're held even beyond death, how are we freed up now? I think it has a lot to do with that line from our epistle about not being quickly shaken. Not being quickly shaken in mind, not being alarmed. God is the God of the living, now and into eternity. So after a moment of reflection, we're going to sing a hymn, and it turns out